listen to that rain. It's always such a pleasure to sit with you in the morning and listen to the downpour. Good morning, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thanks for joining me for today's episode of Cozy Horror. Let's get things started off right. It's always nice to have a job. It's always nice to be employed and be able to pay your bills on time. But all jobs are definitely not created equal. Today's story, we have a realtor who has a very exclusive clientele. Today we have, I'm a realtor who exclusively sells haunted houses. Ever since I was little, death was a next-door neighbor. I mean, literally right next door. I could look out the window and see it. I could watch through my bedroom window as Mom walked towards it. Every day, she would wake up before the sun and make her brisk walk to work. It took me a long time to discover what she did, and even longer to understand it. She would pry bodies apart and put them back together, prettier than they were when they arrived. They arrived in dark vans, bruises all over their bodies, and they would leave with eyeliner and makeup. That's where I learned that one can measure life in shades of purple, whether it be bruises or makeup. Measured, mind you, not defined. So naturally, that's where I saw my first body. I'd try to sneak in now and then, and I guess I was never successful. Mom always thwarted me, but eventually, I just wore her down. It was too much being the mortician and the security guard. So there he was, a fairly innocent death. He looked so natural, but just a little less. I always thought I would take after Mom, and for a while I was on track to. I'm not even sure how I got sidetracked. I enjoyed making Mom's job look nice. She always kept it so dour, and I had wanted to spruce up the place. I felt fulfilled when it all came together, and I felt like I normally do, just a little more. I did it for my house, then I did it for my mom, my friends, my neighbors, and before I even knew what was happening, I was trying to convince people to buy a house. My houses sold, and people took notice of how I put them together. I guess, if I were to be poetic, that's how I took after Mom. I took these houses, the remains of them, and dolled them up as best I knew how. I made it look nice. So nice that you'd never know it was dead at all. For a long time, I thought that when people died, that was it. No ghosts, no heaven or hell. It was a snap, and you were just gone. Like a house. When the furnace goes out, when the walls rot away, and the spider webs consume every window, I thought the house was gone. I know now that's wrong. Despite working with my mom for many years, I never entertained the notion of ghosts. It wasn't until the house on Wilbur Street that I changed my mind. I won't go into too much detail, but that house was its own beast. And if it weren't for a strange but generous buyer, it might have been the end of my career. It was a weed, though. Something that sprouted in me, unwelcome but beautiful nonetheless. A world you might not have ever heard of. A world that probably, if not for what I'm telling you now, you would likely go your whole life without knowing about. In the housing market, there exists a small but dedicated sect reserved for the enigmatic influential, or even the nefarious. I'm talking about the buying and selling of houses that have, in one way or another, been deemed haunted. Just like any realtor, I'll get my hands on a house sometimes. Sometimes I find it myself, sometimes it's offloaded by a larger realty company. Regardless, I'll go in, make the house look as nice as possible, just like I would with any other house. That was before I discovered this unofficial and morbid market. Unlike an unafflicted house, however, I would research and experiment. With enough research, I can gather information on who perished within the house and the cause of death. I also need to be mindful of people who lived in the home, but had relocated, as spirits can travel back to where their emotions were the strongest. like a magnet, pulling in metal sand. After gathering the information, I conduct my small experiments. The severity and nature of the haunting need to be distinguished and defined before I can even list the house. Something you might not know about most hauntings is how consistent they are. Sure, the activity will alter, but it will happen over and over. I've had houses you could set a stopwatch by. I use a marker to outline cups and dishes in order to check if they've been pushed. I take pictures of each room every hour, on the hour, so I can meticulously comb through them. Something you may or may not know about typical hauntings is they can be boring. Rarely do you come across an outwardly aggressive home. And when you do, the type of people that buy those, it's not my place, but it's troubling to think about what they might want the home for. That's neither here nor there, though. Haunted homes sell to many people. You have eccentrics and ghost hunters who want a place for entertainment. There are people who practice the dark arts, though you can typically sniff out the wannabe types. There are even people who just really need a home and try to get a cheaper deal. Depending on the haunting and its interest, sometimes they do. You have to call it a loss at some point and lower the price just below market value. That's how you do it. That's what this house was, I thought. Another suburban home I was going to take a hit on. Boy, was I wrong. Of course, that's how tales like these come to be. If I was right, if all I ever saw was a coffee mug move across the counter, then you'd never hear a peep out of me. The house was on Carter Avenue. If you don't know which Carter Avenue out of the hundreds that likely exist, then yes, you're not meant to. I got it for a bargain from my peer because, well, it was a house that nobody had high expectations for. There wasn't a history of violence or any mention of the occult, just a younger couple that passed away in their sleep. Carbon monoxide leak. To me, though, the house was lovely, if not for a small string of reported activity. The house could have been sold on its merits. It was in a quiet neighborhood. Everything looked new and had been taken care of. It was a picture of suburban living. So I hedged my bets and thought I would just make the house look like a proper home for anyone looking to buy. It took a while, an uncomfortable amount of time, before I'd got a bite. While I toiled away, looking through photos of the house's bedroom, my phone buzzed. It was a buyer. A young couple looking to buy their first home. The woman on the phone beamed about starting a family of their own. So we set up a date to meet, and I plunged further into Carter Avenue. As bizarre as it is to say, I wanted to make sure the haunting was child-friendly. No loud noises or aggressive movements, you understand. For the most part, though, the house was quiet. Sure, there were signs, but the haunting was so mellow, you'd never know it if you weren't looking for it. A slight push that would move a cup from its outline. Pictures on the wall that would go askew, and a penny was even pushed off the counter. That was all, so, just enough. It was just enough activity for it to make the difference between haunted and natural occurrence. Maybe I should have had my wits about me in that regard. Though I know, when I offer myself grace, there's no way I could have known it was anything other than a run-of-the-mill haunting. The day of the showing plays in my head from time to time. I always go back to when I was starting down the hall. It was right before the couple was supposed to show up. I stopped at the top of the stairs and looked down the hallway. It led to all the bedrooms and had light bleeding in from each. The sun was gentle and warm. It created a vignette in the hall. At the end of the hall there was a picture, hanging above a small table, decorated with various books and a small fern. The picture was an oil painting, a stark mixture of black and white. Upon seeing it initially, you'd assume it was nonsense, a Rorschach test of sorts. If you took the time to soak it in, though, at least for me, I made out the picture. It almost always looked like an animal with a wide-open jaw, a howl of anguish. Once I made out the mouth, the rest followed suit. Maybe The face was meant to be beautiful, but it looked straight out of hell to me. It felt crooked. It, however, was a painting in the home that the haunting hadn't affected. To the naked eye, the painting was perfectly straight, lined right up to the surface of the table under it, but it felt crooked. I could feel the painting making one side of my head heavier, craning my neck as if trying to see it from a new angle. The hall itself felt as though it was stretching out, pulling the details of the painting further and further away from me. The once warm vignette ignited from the room, turning into static with the tunnel. So it shouldn't come as a shock when I say I nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard the front door shut. My arms rushed to my chest as if guarding me from an incoming attack. Even without my hands actually on my skin, I could feel my heart smacking around inside. A few breaths in and out calmed me, and I gathered my senses. I quickly rushed down the stairs and spotted the couple, Sandra and Owen Welling. The door had startled me, but I'd informed them upon their arrival that they could just come in, as the house wasn't exactly booked for tours. Bounding down the stairs, I immediately started in with the pleasantries. They looked as normal as can be. The woman was a blonde, her hair just barely touching her shoulders. The man looked tired, almost like he had headed straight to the home from work. His brown hair haphazardly swooped to one side. I couldn't help but notice he was sheepish, letting the woman take the lead and speaking up very little. Admittedly, this annoyed me. They were a couple, and while every dynamic is different, I found it odd that he had so little interest in where he might build a family. It happened, though, and swung both ways. Suppose it's nothing more than a pet peeve, but it did inform me to pay more attention to the wife. So, with her trailing closely behind me, we toured the lower floor. It felt almost like it used to, showing off regular homes. The activity in the house was so sparse that I'd rarely stop to talk about it. In the kitchen, I informed them that it's best to leave cups and dishes a respectful distance from the edge. In the dining room, I informed them that sometimes they could hear a knocking on the floor above. The knocking noise was not audible from anywhere else in the house, which is probably the most peculiar haunt in the home, but it's harmless. She asked questions here and there, but it wasn't until we began to ascend the stairs that she started delving deeper. In the first bedroom, she asked me who the previous occupants had been. I told her it was a young couple, though I only knew their names. We sometimes find photos left behind by the previous occupants, but this time, especially with younger folks, the families affected will snatch up photos before I even get my hands on the house. It might seem odd that I don't go too deep into the lives of those who are supposedly haunting the grounds. I did early on. I'd familiarize myself with their faces and history, but I found that doing so would cause a confirmation bias. I would see faces where there might not have been one, or I'd pick up smells related to the previous death and assume it was paranormal, when it could just be a clogged drain. The woman stalled for a moment and rested her hand on the doorframe. I could only see her back. The sun beaming through the windows wrapped a glow around her thin figure. "It's cold." I hardly heard the words when she spoke them. They were distant, like they were afraid to leave the room. She was right, though. It was cold, and noticeably so. The house was monitored for temperature variations, but nothing so severe. The skin on my arms prickled. I thought the cold would have made me shiver, but after taking in the new chill, I realized my pocket was buzzing. I ignored it, realizing the man had drifted out of sight, though only barely. He stood in the hall, looking at the same painting that had mesmerized me earlier. "This would make a great nursery," the woman said, her voice louder this time, but still distant. I was watching the man, though, his arms sheepishly jostling from side to side like he was fidgeting with something. A tension had built in my chest, partially from the cold gripping my lungs. Reaching into my pocket, I quickly retrieved the phone, intending to ignore the call as the vibrating was audible. "Oh, absolutely. It's great for sunlight in the mornings," I replied, glancing at her as I spoke. I glimpsed the same silhouette before returning to my phone's touchscreen, and just like the painting had before, the illuminated screen stole my attention. I couldn't have been more than a minute, though. Despite how long it felt, the clock in the upper right corner didn't change. An incoming call. The sensation of the phone rattling in my hand acted as a warning bell, a siren of things to come. Incoming call from Sandra Wellings. The words couldn't have felt heavier in my hands. Her voice, when I picked up the phone, couldn't have been louder in my head. I listened to the woman on the other line apologizing. She was embarrassed. They had fallen asleep on the couch and had no alarm set. She was asking me if they could still come by or if I wanted to reschedule. A reply, no matter how desperate I was for it, did not come, and as Sandra continued bidding for my attention, I could only look down the stretching hallway. In the deserted hallway, the only object present was the small white plastic dish and 2 batteries lying nearby. Suddenly I became horrendously aware of the figure that was in the doorway. I couldn't see her as I started down the hall, but God, could I feel her. Her presence felt so stifling, I thought I might fall through the floor. A soft whimper of denial weaseled its way up my throat. It felt like I was being told a story, or rather it felt like a story I'd already known, but that had been pushed deep down. This was someone else's story, a story of a death much more sinister than the public knew. This would be a great room for a nursery, the figure spoke, and as if those words manifested, I could feel strands of hair drop on the side of my face. She must have been as tall as she felt, hunched over with her head pressed against the ceiling, dark strands hanging like stalagmites. She wanted me to look. I could feel it. Her gaze fixed on me and burned holes through my scalp. Closer and closer. I could feel her warm breath wafting on the side of my face. The smell was more noticeable, though, or rather the lack thereof. I could only watch the painting, the hallway, once again tunneling as I pondered if it was safer to look at her or ignore her. Hauntings could get bad. Yes, even this bad. I've experienced little myself, but this wasn't my first time, though my heart still bumped like it was. When the retching began, the decision to focus on the hallway became one that I picked. A guttural and whining scrap lurched from the woman, though. It sounded like pulling marbles down from metal tubing, and after a moment something spilled from her mouth. I could hear small thuds smacking the ground, one after another. Once again, the sound reminded me of marbles. Then she was gone. I released the breath that had been held down as her weight lifted off me, allowing my skin to loosen. Looking down, they were all splayed out at my feet. They must have rolled around quite a bit after hitting the floor. Portrait drawn with AA batteries, a tale of heartbreak, scored by the chiding of a baby. A soft whine, much softer than the woman's. That room really does get so much sun. It had rested such a lovely glow on the crib inside. I could hear the baby crying from within it. I'm sure I could have heard it from anywhere in the house. It was ethereal, something I couldn't escape. It echoed through the walls and bounced around the room as I took my first step inside. The batteries around my feet shuffled aside and rolled, clattering against one another. A game of electric billiards. The sound of the baby crying became less defined with each step I took, its cries being pulled further through the veil. The white wooden slats of the crib ceased to be an obstacle, and I could peek over the edge. I didn't intend to step further. The bile was already churning. The sides of the crib acted like a dam for the wet, sticky mess inside. All that white was painted freshly red, a crimson that glistened in the sun. My legs gave out, and I crashed to the floor. The hardwood vibrated on impact. I felt my throat choke and scratch. Burning came afterwards in intervals. It was getting air, never catching my breath. A burning rose in my chest, nails dragging. Looking down at my shirt, I could see long, dark lines running along my skin, like aged scratch marks. "I'm sorry," I whispered, cowardly, pensive. Looking up, he was lying on the floor, the boyfriend, the man. He was clawing at his chest, and his body writhed. The veins in his eyes crept towards the pupils like vines. His eyes rolled up, his gaze reached far above his head. This mess of a man, he was watching her, so scared of her now. She was looming over me again. All her hate and grief sat like a ball in my neck. All her unbridled horror wrapped around me, and I felt it. I could feel the hot, stinging tears running down my cheek. All that horror, waking up in the middle of the night, feeling how weak your body is. She must have known, or maybe she saw him taking them out. He probably told her he was replacing them. A depth of despair I could only understand when I looked into her eyes. Dying, knowing the life inside of you would follow. I thought, truly, that her face would be horrific. A mangled mess of bones and flesh, red and pulse. Horrific indeed. But there was no blood, just tears. The streams disobeying gravity. They twisted around her face and slipped around the curves of her nose. Her very own soul, a Rorschach. Pain will paint our lives. It can shape the way we see things. It can change the feeling of a room. It can haunt the memories you once held dear. No matter how many times you try to paint over that pain, it's still there. And I felt it on my face that day. As a few of her tears relented, failing to mix with mine, I knew her more intimately than I knew myself. That's the real ghost. I suppose it always will be. The pain. We locked eyes, and although I understood her, the fear did not subside. A part of me felt like if I moved, she would change. If I broke off the conversation, as it were, then I would see something worse. The pain was a mask, and I could feel whatever was under it was in torment. I still think about it sometimes. The man was there in all his horror, face beet red and swollen, his throat ravaged with claw marks as he gasped for air, feeling as though he was being suffocated, regretting the decision he had made, probably telling himself in his final moments that he could have just left, and he was right. Of course, he likely died thinking of himself, and that was a moment of solace for me, that in his last thoughts he realized just how stupid he was. Even as I heard his body writhe around, pudders of liquid spilling from his mouth, even as he smacked the floor with what little strength he had left, begging for mercy, I watched his face, long and black, curtain-like strands of hair cutting off my peripherals, so all I could see was her. I stared into her face, dread growing closer. My eyes started to lose focus as she looked down at me. Her face appeared to stretch away from me like it was retreating down a hallway. She moved further and further, the guttural sound from before echoing around the column of hair she created. It got louder, growing as she shrank. Before too long, her face appeared like a two-dimensional object in the distance, just her misery, hanging solitary in a museum. At that distance, The noise was suffocating. A chirp layered on top of 1,000 other chirps till I couldn't stand it anymore, and my eyelids slammed shut. The noise halted then, and quiet returned. My breathing was deep and ragged, and after wrestling with the thought, I opened my eyes again. Staring down the hallway, I felt the phone in my pocket buzz. Reaching into it, I read that Sandra was trying to get a hold of me again. Only 3 minutes had passed since she called. Accepting the call, I heard her rambling. I only focused on what she was saying when she asked if I was showing other people around. The words came out before I thought about how to phrase them. I just asked, "Did you hear her too?" Sandra chimed that she had, but hung up when the baby started crying, as it was hurting her ears. She continued talking as I zoned out, hypnotized by the hallway once again. "The house isn't a fit for you," I cut her off, cold and direct. "This house was no place to raise a baby. Someone will buy it, but I won't sell it. Damn shame, too. The light coming in through the window at the end of the hall really livens up the place." What a treat it is to get to spend my mornings with you. I think it's probably my favorite part of the day. But I know what you're here for, so let's keep right on rolling with another great story. It's always nice to have admirers. I might know a little something about that. But sometimes being watched isn't all it's cracked up to be. Like today's story, he watches from the corners. My Uncle Phil was a detective in Los Angeles. He died last week, age 75. He'd been blinded in the line of duty in 1993 and got a sweet payout. Only time I ever saw Uncle Phil get upset was when we asked the details of how he'd lost his sight. He refused to tell us, and even talk about it. My mom and brother and I spent the weekend clearing out his house. Uncle Phil was a nice guy overall, but he was also something of a hoarder. It took us 15 hours to get the place even close to clean. In the basement, we found his filing cabinet behind a stack of boxes labeled men's adventure books. The filing cabinet was locked. After my mom and brother had gone for the night, I got my buddy Reuben to come over and try to get the filing cabinet open. Reuben fashions himself as a lockpicker. Took him 16 tries. I was counting, but he finally got it unlocked. In the bottom drawer at the back was a large envelope dated 2008, marked Destroy. Guess he must have forgotten to follow through on it. Inside was a typed transcript of the very last interrogation my Uncle Phil ever did as a detective. There was also an LP, a slab of black vinyl with no sticker, no markings on it at all. I don't have a record player, but Reuben, he said he moonlights as a DJ, and he had one at his pad. So I let him take the record and rip it, send me an MP. He left, and I brought the transcripts upstairs. I read it, and it scared the crap out of me. I was in a panic afterward. I called Reuben, but he didn't answer. I tried his roommates, but they said he hadn't come home. That was 2 days ago. No one's seen Reuben, and his phone's no longer in service. This afternoon I got an anonymous email with an untitled MP3 file. I haven't opened it. I will never open it. I'm posting this transcript of my Uncle Phil's last interrogation here. I'm doing it as a warning. I know record collectors will call me paranoid, but I'm telling you, avoid unlabeled LPs you find in the thrift store or old record crates. If you sent or somehow come across an untitled MP3, be very careful. If it says anything about the Drawn King, delete it immediately. California Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, Investigating Supplement, 1993-78409. Transcript 8/6/1993. PH. The coffee is just on your left. WS. Here? PH. I can help you get it if you... WS. No, I'm fine. Thank you. PH. Alright, okay. It's presently 1640 at August 6, 1993. Detective Phil Hernandez, currently at the Van Nuys station at Van Nuys, California, to interview Captain Wyatt Shepard. This is for LAPD case number 1993-784. Wyatt, I want to go ahead and get down some basic information for our report. Your first name is spelled W-Y-A-T-T. Is that correct? WS. Yeah. And Shepard is spelled S-H-E-P-P-A-R-D. Right. And your occupation is firefighter. Yes, Captain. Listen, I can explain what happened. We're getting to that. First, I just need a little more background information. You told my officer at intake that this began 2 days ago after an incident. You have to understand, I tried to stop it. Wyatt, I need you to start at the beginning. I need you to take me back to the night of the fire at Burbank. You just told my officer that all this, everything that went down with Mr. Carson, it started with the fire. I want to hear why you think that. Okay, it was the apartment. That was the fire at the Oakcrest apartment on Myers, right? Right. Our engine was the first one on the scene. A 2-alarm on the second floor. Everyone had been evacuated by the time we got there. All but one person on the third floor, the east corner. The manager said his name was Nash, something Nash. The man was a recluse, hadn't been out of his room in something like 20 years. Had his food, his clothes, all his stuff delivered to his door. Never stepped a foot outside, so the manager told me. You went to Mr. Nash's door, brought him out? Wasn't that easy. Fire was spreading quick. Me and Tomlinson, Nadia Tomlinson, part of your truck company? Yes. She and I took the east stairs. It was smoky, but we still had visibility at that time. Mr. Nash didn't respond to our knocks, our shouts, so we used a battering ram. Took down the door and then stepped inside. That's when we noticed that it was weird. You mentioned weird how? The whole interior. These were regular apartments, built in the 50s or so. 1 or 2 bedrooms, most of them. The typical layout. Not this guy's place. His apartment was totally modified. All the walls were rounded out. Rounded? What do you mean? He'd smoothed them all down to remove the corners. There were no corners in the place. No windows either. It was like being inside a big egg. He had painted them white, too. Wasn't done professionally, if you know what I mean. It was clear that the work was of one person over years and years. Just filling in the corners, smoothing them out. And the furniture was like that as well. Yes, all the chairs were beanbags. The tables were sliced tree trunks. It was crazy, but we weren't in there to examine the decor. We were in there to get Mr. Nash out. He wasn't going to come easy. He was guarding this wall full of records. Like the records you smashed at the station. The records I smashed and scattered across the field behind the station. Yeah, we found the pieces. But you didn't put them back together, right? You couldn't do that. No, we haven't put the pieces together. You need to burn them, to melt them. Wyatt, we've gotten off track. Tell me about the apartment. Nash had tons of those records, easily 1,000, all stacked up, and he was holding one of them, sitting on his futon mattress and yelling this crazy stuff about how he couldn't leave, how if he left the apartment, he'd die. You gotta understand, the building was heating up. Smoke was filling the hallways. We had to get out, so we went to grab him, and that's when he pulled the revolver. He put it to his head, said he'd rather lose control over his own death. As me and Tomlinson were getting close, trying to calm him down, he pulled the trigger, and it didn't fire. It was an old firearm. I didn't get a good look at it. maybe it was busted. Anyway, I was able to smack the gun out of his hand, and we got him up and out. That's when you lost him. I didn't. We didn't lose him. We got out into the hallway, and he was carrying on, acting crazy. The smoke was so bad. We had respirators on. Put one on him, too. Had the added benefit of keeping him quiet. We moved fast down the hall towards the stairs, but the flames were coming up, right up behind the floor, so we had to stop. This is right outside the apartment, 312. Yeah, somewhere near there, I guess. I wasn't looking. Okay, go on. So I have Mr. Nash back in the corner, right behind me. Tomlinson is radioing down, trying to get help, trying to help the guided crews. They've got the hoses hitting that part of the building, putting down those fires long enough for us to get back. Maybe it's been 2 minutes? Probably less. Nash is right behind me, holding one of those records and mumbling, all scared. He's terrified and pulling on my coat. I turn and look at him, tell him it's only been a few seconds. That's when he shouts something freaky. He says, "He's here." I asked Nash who he was talking about, because I was worried, you know? Did we miss somebody? But at the same time, I had to turn back to Tomlinson, because she was giving the signal that we can move forward. That's when I hear it. You said it was a whistle. Yeah, it was like a little lullaby. Just a few notes, sing-songy, the way you do to a baby. Someone else in the apartment building? No, it sounded further away than that. Like from outside, like above the apartment building. But that's just what I heard, a whistling, a tune. The thing is, fires are loud. That's what most people don't think about when they sound like tornadoes. Just this blasting industrial sound. But I could hear that whistle over the flames. It was crystal clear. And it was just the once. Yes, just the once. And this guy Nash, he screams like he's being murdered. The worst scream I've ever heard. He's behind me still, right? I haven't turned around or anything, but I've heard people screaming before, in fires, several times. Horrible sounds. It'll haunt you. When I tell you that, they say, "Oh, you must hate going to amusement parks." But that's not it. People screaming on roller coasters or... Right. But that's not the same sound. What I'm talking about is, actually, it's playgrounds. I can't go to regular parks. For me, it's hearing children scream, even if it's because they're playing, having fun. The pitch is high and piercing, and that's what someone dying in a fire sounds like. Broken glass, screaming as the superheated air hits the lining of the throat. Anyway, this was worse than that. To be honest, it sounded like Nash was being turned inside out. So of course I reacted. I spun around to him and he's gone. He's just gone. And the record he was holding is lying there next to a little pool of blood. That's it. Poof. And Mr. Nash couldn't have just snuck past you. How? I had him in a corner. My back pressed up against him. I would have felt him push past. Would have seen him going down the hall. No. He was just gone. Vanished. All right. You couldn't find him. You get back outside. We looked. We looked everywhere, but the fire was growing and the other engine hadn't showed up yet. So we had to leave the building. I took the record and we exited. The next 3 hours we fought the fire. Didn't put it out until nearly 2 in the morning. The record was supposed to be handed to the officer on the scene. I know, but in the chaos, it ended up with us, in the engine and then back to the station. As soon as I noticed it, I called Stefan. Officer DeNovo. Yes, he's a friend. We belong to the same gym. We know a couple of the same people. So when I saw I had the record, I called him. He said I should hang on to it, and he'd swing by the station to grab it the next day. It wasn't like we considered the thing evidence, or right then it was just Nash that was missing. that record have a sleeve or a jacket or whatever? No, it was just a disc. Corners, right? Sleeve would have had corners. Your truck company consisted of 5 firefighters. You, Captain, Nadia Tomlinson, Lieutenant, Dave Carlson, driver, Jalen Ordelia, and Grace Zhang, firefighters. Yes, and they all saw the record. We looked it over together. Was there anything written on it, or... Yes, the label. It was printed. Like, this thing was pressed and legit. I don't know much about vinyl, but it didn't look homemade or anything. And what did the label say? It had some numbers, and then just this one phrase. Not like a song list or a band name or anything. Just this one phrase printed on it. It said, "Play me, and I'll come to you." And did you? Yes, we did. We put it on the turntable in the break room, and all of us sat around and listened to it for a few minutes. First 15 seconds were just tones, like electronic noises. And then there was, I don't know, like a field recording, like someone was outside with a microphone. There was wind and chimes and maybe trees rustling and footsteps crunching on rocks and pebbles. Then a voice came on. It was Nash. You're saying he made the record? It was his voice for sure, but like a lot younger. I'm guessing it was recorded 20 years ago at least, maybe even longer. What was he saying? It's like a spell, near as I can describe it. It's him speaking English and chanting stuff. Can't recall all the words, but the phrases were a bunch of craziness. The weirdest one was like, "Cyst with twins inside, the edge of light, and praise the blood-ridden splinters in the hands of the sepulchral seers." All of it garbage, right? I thought so at the time. I really thought so, but at the end of the record, it was just 10 minutes long of chanting. Nash says, "I conjure you. You are sown. You are here. You are grown. The drawn king. Come to me." The Drawn King. Right. That was the name. What he called it. The talking stopped there. Then we're all sitting in the rec room, right? We've all just come from this fire and we're cooling down and getting some much needed downtime. But that record, all of us, we were on edge. I looked around the room and even Jalen, the coolest guy, he was looking anxious as all hell. Grace wanted to just shut it off right then and there, but we didn't. That's the thing I most regret. We didn't. So what happened? The record kept going. Those sounds of wind and chimes and rustling of trees, and then the whistling. It drifted in, soft at first, and then louder and closer. It was the same whistling that I heard at the Oakcrest apartment. Same exact one. I got chills. My whole body just felt electric in the worst way. Like that inbuilt threat system we have. The primal one. It was going crazy, warning me. Warning you about what? That bad stuff was going on. The whistling drifted away again. And then Nash came into the microphone, and I'm just recalling it from memory, okay? He said, "I've done the conjuring. You heard it with me. Now you are tuned. Tuned today. Tuned 10 years from now." That was the word. Tuned. Then he said, "And if you want the Drawn King to come to you, look in the nearest corner and let him in. He's always watching you from the corners, always waiting to come through. Stare back at him. Stare into the corner. Then count to 6 very slowly, saying his name each time. Do not blink. Do not turn away. You will hear the whistle, and that means he's approaching. From then on, when you see him, he will come to you, and he will set you free." That's what Nash said. That's when the recording ended. Him being the Drawn King. Does that mean anything to you? No, never heard of it. Of him. And this whole thing about corners, you're talking regular corners, like the walls here. Yes, any corner. Any three edges meeting. I suppose it could be as small as the corner of a cereal box, or as big as the corner of a building. I never really thought of corners as being particularly scary. That's because corners aren't a thing you usually think about, right? Like on a daily basis or anything. But if you do think about them, if you really focus on the idea, you'll feel this tremor in your gut. And you'll realize that corners, they're something you've always been uneasy looking at. That's why Nash's place was the way it was. See, that's what I realized. His apartment, Nash got rid of the corners in his place, because he conjured the Drawn King, and he wasn't safe. Like the record said, you can call him, you can see him, and he comes to you. Maybe Nash thought it was a good idea at first, you know. People who are into magic, they always use it to try and summon spirits and things, whatever, to become rich or find love or get power. But this thing, the Drawn King, I'm guessing Nash wasn't prepared. You told Officer Rollins that you think Mr. Nash was taken by this, Drawn King. Yes, and you also said that he, or it, took Dave Carson. Yes, Dave disappeared, same way as Nash. Well, most of him disappeared. Officers recovered Dave's lungs and larynx at your fire station. You have to understand. I'm trying to, Wyatt. To be frank, it sounds crazy. I know that, but you don't see what I've seen. Explain it to me then. What exactly happened to Mr. Carson? After we listened to the record, everyone got upset, creeped out. Tomlinson, Jalen, Grace, they went upstairs to bed to tune out. Me and Dave, we went to the kitchen. Late night snack. Dave used to whip up these meatball sandwiches that, Anyway, he was one of those tough city kids, kicked out of his house when he was in high school. Minor miracle that he made it to 21. Even bigger miracle that he got into the academy. Dave and I had our run-ins, a few tussles, but he was a good firefighter. Laser focused when he was on the job, and total clown when he wasn't. That clown side, the Joker, that's why he decided to try it out. To prove that it was all crap. That the apartment, the record, the Drawn King, they were all just products of Nash's sick mind. Okay, so what happened? Well, Dave and I, we tried it. Tried what? Well, like I said, we were in the kitchen, at the table. Dave turned his chair around and pointed to the corner. It was across the room. I think we kept some gear there at one time, but it was empty. Only dust and shadows. So he stares at it, stares at the corner, starts to count. With each number, he says the name, the Drawn King. We're laughing at first, but we can't both help but feel the pressure. I don't know how to explain it, like when a storm is approaching, and you can feel the heaviness come down, fill the air with electricity. Soon we were both counting, slow and saying his name, and our eyes are locked on the corner. We couldn't look away. So we get to 6, and that's when we hear it, the whistle, like at the apartment fire. Yeah, just the same, just as haunting as on the record, a lullaby, just a few notes. And this was coming from outside. It was distant, like on the edge of hearing, but it wasn't outside. It sounded exactly like it was coming from behind the corner, like right inside of it. And you went and looked? I jumped up with my flashlight and walked over, keeping the beam on the corner. There was nothing there, just dust. Me and Dave were both shaken, though. Had that rubber-legged feeling you get when you step off a roller coaster. Adrenaline pumping through us. We went upstairs and we came up with all sorts of ways to dismiss what had happened. And the rest of your company, they were asleep. None of them heard that whistle? No. All right, go on. I was in the bathroom washing my face when I heard it again. The whistle. Only it was real close this time. Too close, like right there in the room with me. So I look up into the mirror and I see the corner of the bathroom behind me, and I see him. I swear to God, I see him coming out of the corner, staring right at me. Who was staring at you, Wyatt? The Drawn King. I just knew it was him. This was a person, maybe once, but something horrible had happened. He was on the floor, crouched down like an animal, peeking out from the corner at me. His face was all twisted. Twisted? Twisted how? A couple years ago, we were called to a food processing plant. Guy there, he fell into one of those industrial mixers, the kind with the massive stainless steel whisks. It pulled him like taffy. Taffy with bones in it, and that's what the Drawn King looked like. Only he was moving, alive, staring at me. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them, he was gone. That's when I heard something downstairs. And Dave Carson, was he upstairs with you still, or? He was in the bay, holding an axe and a flashlight, looking under the engines, all panicked and sweating. Dave nearly cut me in half when I came up on him. I'd said his name aloud, but he was too far gone. I asked him what he was doing, and he told me someone was after him, someone all bent and warped out of shape. I knew he'd caught a glimpse of him too. We searched the garage every inch, but we didn't find anything. Did you rouse the others, or? No. We were feeling foolish. Neither of us wanted to admit that we were seeing things, and the same things at that. I figured we were just exhausted, stressed out. We talked about it maybe being PTSD from the encounter with Nash, but Dave hadn't been inside the apartment. So we turned on all the lights in the kitchen and just sat there. Tried to stay calm. We had some tea. Dave said he thought it could be something he'd read about in a book when we were taking classes at the community college. Something called FoulArT. That's a mental condition, correct? Yes, it's where two people share the same psychotic delusion. Like seeing something following you. Something coming out from the corner. I mean, I'd never heard of it before, but it made sense. We both had listened to the record, stared at the corner, counted and said the name. We heard the whistle. Maybe we both had a mental break at the same time, you know? Stranger things have happened, right? Anyway, that kind of calmed me down. Calmed us both down. All right. There was no way we were going back to sleep. Dawn was close. Lights were all on. And after a couple hours of quiet, of not seeing anything, I kind of felt stupid. Like kids who scare themselves telling ghost stories or trying to freak each other out. Nash, the record, it had all gotten under our skin. Dave wanted to smoke. He'd do it in the parking lot out back. This time, though, we kept the door open, just in case. I don't know if it was so we could keep an eye on each other, or for me to keep tabs on him. Again, our nerves had gotten fried. Our minds were getting the best of us. So Dave goes over to the door, pushes it open, and steps out. But he keeps his foot there, so, I can see him. It's dark out there, but there's a light in the lot, so it's not like... Anyway, he lights up a smoke, takes a couple drags, kind of laughs. I remember that. Then we hear it again. The whistle. Only this time, it's okay. Take a break. What'd you hear? The whistle. It wasn't like before. It wasn't off in the distance or above us or outside in the corner. It was loud, like thunder, enough to make us want to cover our ears, like an air raid siren, and Dave turned to look at me, and we both knew. My God, in that split second, we both knew, and I don't know how to describe it, but it was like our souls just shattered. He knew it was the end. His eyes locked onto me, and take your time. He screamed. Dave screamed the same as Nash, the same as someone being burned alive. As he screamed, his eyes just boring holes into mine, his pain and fear, and he turned to look outside at the corner of the station, and as the Drawn King grabbed him, he dragged Dave inside on his belly. Dave's nails grinded desperately against the asphalt. The door slammed shut. You saw this. Yes, I saw the Drawn King's arm, his hands. Those fingers were too long, too sharp. He had Dave by the back, and there was blood spraying everywhere. And I ran out there after him, yelling his name, and kicked open the door, and there was his cigarette, still lit, still smoking, and there was a big puddle of thick blood and body parts, pieces. No sign of the rest of Dave Carson. No sign. I swear to God, he was gone, and this Drawn King took him. I know how it sounds, okay? I do. But you didn't wake the others or call the cops, right? You did something else. Yes, I went back inside, into the kitchen. The record that Nash had made, it was sitting there on the counter, and I smashed it. Then as the sun was coming up, I threw the pieces into the field. That's when I realized that Nash, he'd defeated the Drawn King by rounding off all the corners in his apartment, right? It kept him safe for decades. I couldn't do that. How was I going to do that? So I realized there was another way. You cut your eyes out with a potato peeler. I suppose a knife or a pin would have been easier. Why did you do that, Wyatt? It was the thing I remembered Nash saying on the record. I guess maybe he didn't think of it, or he didn't have the guts to go through with it. Me, I didn't want to be trapped like a zoo animal the way he was, so I figured I'd do the other thing. If I can't see the Drawn King, then he can't come to me. I'm pretty sure my 5-year-old nephew thinks the same way. Obviously it worked. I'm here, aren't I? Yeah, you're here. It's a good thing those records burned, but I smashed up the very last one. Dave Carson's dead, Wyatt. Torn to pieces, basically, and you're the last person seen him. I should remind you that according to your company, Nadia Tomlinson, Grace Zhang, when they came downstairs at the fire station, they found quite a scene. Your eyeballs on the kitchen counter, Dave Carson missing, big puddle of blood, you babbling about things coming out of the corners. That's a bad look. Miss Tomlinson, she says you were acting strange after the fire, after listening to the record, and as you said, you and Dave had run-ins before. I didn't kill him. Your fingerprints were on Dave Tomlinson's windpipe. His blood was also all over your hands. I told you that's how I found him. You're going to be charged with Mr. Carson's murder, Wyatt. Well, I won't be convicted. I didn't do it. I'll prove it in court. We got a lot of evidence to the contrary. And besides, I've heard the record. What? Sit down. Now listen to me. In the basement of the Oakcrest apartment, there's a storage room that survived the fire. And the water. We did a thorough investigation and found 2 boxes of Nash's records. I listened to one of them last night. Your description is very accurate. In fact, I got the record here on the table in front of you. So you know. It's just a creepy novelty record is all. A joke. The contents of the box, the other records. We dropped them off at a donation center. Please! I don't want this to... Do what, Wyatt? Confess to killing Mr. Carlson? No. Wyatt, you're kidding me, right? You think that if I look at the corner right now, if I, count to 6 and say the Drawn King over and over again, that he'll appear like Mephistopheles? Please, I'm begging you. You heard the record. I'm going to prove to you that the Drawn King don't exist. That you've been tainted by that record, by your own mental illness, your deep-seated hatred for Mr. Carson. Don't. For the record, no pun intended, I'm turning on the record to my left, on the floor. It's empty, maybe a dust bunny or 2. Certainly nothing scary or twisted there. And I'm staring at the corner. Here we go. 1, the Drawn King. 2, the Drawn King. 3, don't do this, detective, please. 3, the Drawn King. 4, the Drawn King. 5, the Drawn King. I'm begging you. 6, the Drawn King. And Now, how long, Wyatt? No. I don't hear nothing. No whistle, no creepy noises at all. And I'm looking and... Nope, there's no person hiding in the corner. Guess I was right about the dust bunnies. Note, an audible whistle is heard on the tape recorder. It is of medium volume, melodic. Oh, God. Don't mess with me, Wyatt. You heard it. You heard it. He's coming. I'll be back in a few minutes. You stay seated and... Jesus! What is... You see him. I know you see him. What is... No. Use your pen. Use your pen. There's a garbled scream, believed to be from Detective Hernandez. Tape cuts out then. Listening to the rain always makes me long for a pot of tea. I might go make one while we listen to this next story. Like the man said, you gotta know when to hold 'em, and you gotta know when to fold 'em. But the subject of our next story may have a little bit of confusion in that department. Let's move right on into, if you gamble with a man with a hat for a face, know what you're wagering. All I ever wanted was for my wife and I to live comfortably. But the longer we stayed together, the higher our bills became. We'd already fought off debt from college, barely scraping by. Even after we paid them off, we were only able to afford a tiny apartment on the outskirts of New York. Sidewalks laid cracked everywhere, while finely condemned buildings sat sadly against their crooked foundations. Crooked lampposts that hang only by electrical wires. Graffiti marked every street corner, and bland art that existed without rhyme or reason. Homeless people could be found on every street corner, a constant reminder of what would happen to my wife and I if I failed to keep up with our payments. However, I managed to make somewhat decent money as a plumber, but even then, it sometimes wasn't enough to deal with the loan sharks, the hefty utility bills, the food prices, and gas money. I was willing to do anything to get us out of there. And that is where I encountered gambling. I was willing to take the risk. I'd take any chance to obtain a reward, even just a small one. It started out with a handful of poker games. Then I moved on to scratch tickets and slot machines. All I needed was enough to get by. Unfortunately, obtaining a payday from the casinos was impossible. I started growing desperate, which only led to more debt. The whole cycle sucked me down like Odysseus' ship into Charybdis' maw. Just like that, my relationship with my wife began to tear apart. My wife and I were once so close. Before we married, there would be days that we'd work together at the wood shop, creating 3D prints of various sci-fi characters in video games. Other times we'd study the components of circuits and use them to create elaborate lighting displays whenever Christmas arrived. Our wedding day was supposed to be the greatest day of our lives. Instead of relying on the help of others, like we did back in college, we relied on ourselves. But my actions tore all that apart. I didn't know what else to do either. A few nights ago, I arrived at my apartment, having completed a 10-hour shift fixing drains of several upper-class tenements. I rested my hand on the knob, expecting the worst from my wife. Sighing, I pushed the door open. The moment I did, she was already in the front hall. Her eyes were scrunched, and she was holding a bank statement, smacking it for emphasis. "Care to explain?" she demanded. I rubbed my temples, removing my scum-covered overalls and plopping them right into the nearest laundry hamper. We locked eyes. Breaking eye contact with her would only ignite her anger further. She was holding another piece of evidence of my failure to strike it rich. All I could do was stand there sheepishly, tail tucked behind me, and wait to get ripped a new one. No words would come out of my mouth. She marched up to me, holding it in my face. "Frank, you wasted $3,000 at the casino again, didn't you?" my wife bellowed. I set my toolbox down and washed the pipe gunk off my hands. looking down for just a bit. Turn around and look me in the eye. Resting a hand on my eyes, I glanced over her petite frame. Then I began to speak. You can live comfortably if you just give... Enough of your excuses. We nearly lost our apartment twice from all the betting on the slots. You wasted our heating money on roulette. And now this. The landlord wants $4,000 in 2 weeks. And if we can't get it sorted out, we're going to lose our apartment. I held up my hand reassuringly. Look, just let me figure this out. I'll think of some way to get money. You better, otherwise we're getting a divorce. You got it? Without another word, I put on a casual outfit and exited for some fresh air, shutting the door behind me. I gazed back at the unpolished apartment number on the frame. Wincing, I clenched a fist and descended the rickety stairs. Eventually my boots hit the cracked pavement and I headed off. I stood outside a graffiti-covered subway station, pacing around, hands in my pockets. My fists constricted as I pounded a nearby wall. There's no way I could have been able to make that kind of money. Craps were too unpredictable, arcade machines were always rigged, and roulette was too high in stakes. Seeing red, I screamed and kicked a wall as hard as I could. My foot throbbed, and once I was done with my fit, I broke down sobbing. The sidewalk darkened with my tears. I pressed my head against it, clawing at it until my fingernails turned crimson. Then felt a tap on my shoulder. Wiping my tears away, I glanced over. A card was lying on the floor. Its borders were covered in green dollar symbols. The rest of the card was a silver color, shiny enough to reflect my face in it. Written in gold letters were the following: Aces High Casino. Win 1 round of blackjack and earn $50 million. No monetary wager needed. Table 777. My eyes lit up. All I had to do was win 1 game of blackjack and I'd be rich. Dimples formed at the corners of my cheeks and I pumped my fist. I nearly clicked my heels in joy, but I decided against it. I'd already caused enough of a scene already, and I wanted to make sure nobody knew my secret. When I flipped it around, it had an address also written in gold letters. Despite the address being in an unknown area, I still managed to pull it up on my phone's maps and arrive without much struggle. The casino itself was a pigsty, to say the least. Smokers polluted the air and the prison-gray interior. Slot machines with broken lights clicked and whirred while cheap dice clattered against tables with peeling felt. Meanwhile, the concrete floor was covered in colonies of roaches while neglected beer bottles sat against the rugs of several tables. The only thing that was well kept was the bar and a room draped with navy blue curtains and gold sashes. Emblazoned over the doorway was the number 777. This was the first time I'd entered a casino smiling. For once, I thought this was my lucky night. When I pushed the curtain away, they revealed a room with an ornamented black wallpaper, an assortment of oak desks, and other furniture. The walls were covered in fine Baroque paintings. On the floor was a single blue carpet covered in opulent tapestries. I followed the back wall to a single dealer table coated in green felt. 2 seats were present, with one person taking the seat on the left. He was shaking with what I assumed then was excitement. Behind him was a dealer, a trim man with blonde hair and a top hat over his nose and eyes. He wore a dapper tuxedo free of blemishes that shimmered in the light of a single hanging gas lamp. His skin was pure, free of moles, glistening with a slight amount of glitter. "Why, hello there," the man spoke, his voice slicker than the gel in his hair. "Are you here to win big?" Unlike the loan sharks, his teeth were cleaner than a freshly washed plate. "Yup, deal me in," I said, straightening my back, shuffling into the last seat. The other player had his jaw locked together. His eyes were drooping and bloodshot. Sweat pooled around his brow like glass beads. Just like him, I always felt nervous about losing, so their reactions were understandable. "You know the rules of blackjack. I deal out cards. You say hit me if you want more cards. Get closest to 21 without going over. Dealer only draws 2 cards, and you can also surrender your cards for half your bet. When you don't want any more cards, say the word stand, the dealer said, shuffling his cards through his hands and manipulating them like a sculptor with a ceramic pot. I double blinked. Wager? What do I bet with? Play a game, and I'll tell you. The mystery man focused on passing out the cards. First, he brought out 2 cards for himself and dealt 2 more to each player. Instantly, he flipped over his cards. Jack King, 20. I clutched the velvet black card, seeing what I was dealt. A 10 and a 7 of hearts. I forced my face into a neutral smile. My stomach twisted. There was no way I could get 21 that easily. Surrender, I said, pushing my cards to the dealer. All he did was shuffle the cards and toss me 2 more. They didn't even bother looking up at me during the process. The other players started clutching his stomach. His smile vanished. I carefully looked over the guy's cards. 7 and a 2 of clubs. Hit me, the guy on the left choked out. An ace of spades. Total of 10. Sweat trickled down his head like a shower in April. His eyes welled up with tears, while foam developed in the corners of his mouth. I raised an eyebrow, wondering what his deal was. I knew the stakes of gambling, but my sixth sense was telling me something was just not right here. No, it couldn't be true. Even if there was some kind of string attached or fine print I didn't read, I couldn't risk giving up on that kind of money. Besides, this might have been my only chance to obtain such a vast reward without much risk. Hit me, the man wheezed. 5 of hearts. His teeth chattered. While I waited for my turn, I stood up and walked around the room, getting a closer look at all the ornate gadgets and such. My eyes focused on a painting on the leftmost wall. It resembled a man in a rich military regalia, but something made my hair stand on end. His upturned white mustache looked damp, and his face sagged like they were crying. Linear, stick-like shadows were cast on the sleeves. Edging forward, they came into focus. Hands. I followed their form outward, which extended into oily, dripping arms. Shh. A faint noise echoed from somewhere in the room. What? I mouthed, turning an ear to the source. Shh. It came from the painting. I backed away, hands at my side. Was someone dragged into that painting? Where are you going? You forgot to pay up, the dealer yelled back, hands slamming on the table and pulling out a sack of navy blue poker chips. I double-took. I thought the card said that no monetary wager was needed. There isn't. Then I looked at the ground. There was a second rug on the ground. The tapestry matched, but its pattern didn't match with the other rug. It was off-center from the rest of the decorations, like someone didn't even bother setting it up properly. Taking a closer look, I could hear faint whispers coming from it, too. When I looked back up, the guy on the left was gone. I rushed over, checking his cards. A total of 25. Swallowing saliva, I stood in confusion, wondering what to do next. I scraped my fingernails against my palm. I needed that money. If I didn't get it, I'd lose my wife and my apartment. And what about loan sharks? Only God knew what would happen to me if I didn't pay up. What was I going to do? What would happen if I lost? Would I turn into another object, just like the other guy? Or would it be a worse fate than that? That's because there isn't a monetary wager. I'm still taking half of what you owe. In my game, your payment is in pain. A sharp stab punched my left side. It felt heavier than before, like my veins were replaced with tungsten. I grabbed my fingers around my chest. The area around the pain almost felt like a tumor. Brushing around the area, I could make out a cylindrical mass. I tried to inspect it some more, but the pain overwhelmed me, and I crumpled to the ground. I crouched down on all fours, trying to get back to my seat, but the pain froze me in place. Reaching out a hand, I called out for help, but I got nothing. Slithering away, I pulled back the curtain to the entrance of the casino. I spat on the ground from the bludgeoning pain. Don't feel out of luck? You can still surrender once more and have 2 chances left. The dealer smiled, adjusting his hat. It was only a glimpse, but I caught a look at his upper face. His eyes were on his hat, and his forehead was blank. The dealer looked plucked straight out of an Alice in Wonderland book. What or who was this guy? Think long and hard about it. I saw you arguing with your wife. I clambered back to my seat. Still didn't know what the dealer did to me. Something in me forced me to get back up and keep playing. More questions ate at me the longer I played. How did he know that information? Then I remembered feeling a tap on the back at Grand Central Station. The card that brought me here. He couldn't have been human. Was he some kind of demon? I didn't bother asking. There wasn't any way he would spill the beans about his nature anyway. After what seemed like hours, I managed to writhe back to my seat, slumping over the table like I'd just had the worst hangover. Ready to try again? The charming man said, resting his chin on his interlocking hands. Reluctantly, I gave him a thumbs up. He took back the cards and began manipulating the deck again. I analyzed every move he made. None of the cards were tricked. He wasn't second dealing, and he didn't have any aces up his sleeve. Never revealing anything under the table either. His honesty was the only thing that brought me any reassurance. Still, keeping an eye out was critical. The dealer revealed his cards. 2 tens again, 1 of spades and 1 of hearts. His face was harder than diamonds and glowing like one, too. Not a pleasing glow, but one that vexed anyone that dared to glare at it. I looked at my cards, an ace and a 7, 18. Gripping my lower abdomen, I stayed crumpled in agony. The odds of getting a blackjack were slim, and stabbing pain skewed my thoughts. Surrender, I wheezed. The words slipped out of my mouth like a dying breath of a wounded soldier. The dealer smiled, holding a pile of blue poker chips around him. He waved his hand over the mound and made an inaudible chant. Then they vanished. I held my hands over my face, bracing myself. Suddenly the pain doubled, shifting to my right like a mudslide down a hill. Now I knew everything the previous player was going through. I vomited out something hard and blue. It was a poker chip. Suddenly my guts turned and another 7 spilled out. My esophagus wound itself into knots, more contorted than cobwebs. I forfeit. The man started to smile. Without these? With a thud, the hat-faced dealer pulled out a jar filled with a kidney and a piece of liver. They still oozed with blood that pumped and fit their containers. I remembered how the dealer said that there was no monetary wager. He never said there wasn't a wager at all, though. I paid in pain, and my wager was my organs. You want them back? Then win them. He set them back on the ground. Now there was no choice. My fate was sealed if I tried to leave. I started to shed tears. If I didn't get those organs back and fast, I was done for. Even if someone saw me passed out on the floor, finding donors for organs wasn't guaranteed. And even then, it had just put me further in debt. Nothing would be solved. Then again, was trying to beat this guy even worth it? No, the reward was too great. Taking a deep breath, I sat back down. Reluctantly, I asked that he proceed. The dealer drew out cards like before. He took the cards and gave them a good shuffle. Plucking 2 cards out of the stack, he revealed them. A king and a 9. Another poker chip tumbled up my throat. I spat it out, red and blue plastic heaping together. Not paying attention to the mess I made, he handed me 2 cards. A jack and a 2. A 12. Hit me. An ace. An ace could count as 1 or 11. depending on what other cards were drawn. Still had a fighting chance. Hit me. A 5. His dead stare tore at my soul. I scratched against the felt, the wounds on my finger reopening. From the corner of my eye, I could see him frowning. Are you going to play, or do you want all that money to go to waste? Shut up, I said through gritted teeth. Hit me. I watched the dealer play out the last card. A queen. You lose, the dealer said coldly, grabbing a pile of poker chips and holding them close. He waved his hands over the mound and made another incantation. Then they vanished once more. Everywhere at once, burning pain seared my skin, making me black out. When I woke up, felt my arms, they were covered in something hard and blue and plastic. My clothes were gone. I examined my extremities and my torso. My skin was missing, replaced with poker chips. They were shaped to fit every part. Cracks filled with blood gushed out with every slight movement I made. Horrified, I spilled my guts. More poker chips slid out of my throat. Piles of skin laid clumped to the side of the table in hideous pink and blood-red sheets. I think you know what's at stake now. One try left. You better make it count, unless you want to end up as an object for all eternity. The rigidity of my plastic-coated skin made every movement expose more and more cracks, searing my muscles. I groaned as I raised myself up. Crimson liquid dampened the table. I pounded at it. This was it. I either walked out of here with my money and saved my marriage, or I lost and suffered a fate worse than death. Giving up was not an option. I gave the mysterious man a death glare, not even bothered by his resistance. He plucked out 2 cards, a 9 and a 10. This was my chance. Then my cards were revealed, a 10 and a 2. Fingers rattling, I took a deep breath and let the calmness seep into me. Hit me, I sputtered. Another 2. Huffing, I opened my mouth to speak again. The dealer just stared at me, tilting his head like a vulture waiting for roadkill. The poker chips rattled again, grinding against each other. Hit. I paused for a moment, collecting my thoughts. At a value of 14, I needed at least a 6 to beat the dealer, but an 8 or higher would result in disaster. Gulping down another chaser of saliva, I spoke. Hit me. To my chagrin, a 5 slipped out of the hand. I was now tied. Staring at the pile of skin and my other organs, I closed my eyes and shook in horror. An ace or a 2 were the only cards I could draw in order to win. I looked down at my cards, sweat dripping on the table. With a quick glance, I gazed at the eyes on the man's silk hat. Don't keep me waiting, the man demanded. I'd begun to hyperventilate. His stare grew more intense the longer I waited. His confident smile turned into a frown of irritation. Eyebrows and mouth were twisted into a hideous snarl. He rattled his fingers against the dealer's table. The cacophony made my ears go numb. Then I whispered, Hit me. The man darted up, smiling back in anticipation. I'm sorry, what was that? Closed my eyes, expecting the worst. Hit me, I screamed at the top of my lungs. Then, the last card was revealed. A 2. I had won. My mouth dropped open. The sheet of skin unfurled themselves and flattened over me. 2 organ jars spilled over, their contents rising in a beam of white and torpedoing back into my body. Immediately I yelped at the top of my lungs, clicking my heels and doing a little jig. I regained my strength, instantly looking around for traces of my prize. For several minutes I wasn't able to uncover anything. Staring directly at the dealer's face, I asked him to reveal the prize. I don't have it with me, he said blankly. Not listening, I scrutinized every inch of the room, looking beyond his station, checking under the table everywhere. I searched everywhere for my prize, my happiness dissipating. With each step I took, my smile faded even further, twisting into a frown. My nose crinkled. "Where's my 50 mil?" I demanded, overturning the table, ripping off the ornate paintings and yanking the tasseled rugs off the floor. "You promised me 50 mil if I beat you. Do you realize what's going to happen to me if I don't get that money, you charlatan?" The strange man just stood there, not even acknowledging my plea. "You promised me money. You're a thief," I roared, pointing an accusing finger at him. "I only did this for my wife, to save my marriage. I almost gave up my life trying to help my family out. You can't take that away from me." The demon stuck his hands behind his back and shook his head. He rolled his eyes back and thought. Something was up with him. "You aren't like the other gamblers," he said. "What other gamblers?" I said, looking back. "They all wanted the money for worthless things. A mansion with fountains and a view, hookers, a trip to Tahiti." He paced around me, his face rather relaxed and calm. Never once did he lose eye contact with me. "But you had such determination to help your family that you would risk everything. I admire that. It took me a while, but I figured out that you're actually a kind-hearted person." I saw red and tried to punch him. He grabbed my wrist, shoving it back. "Listen to me. I understand your rage. There never was a prize in the first place. It was nothing but a lure to capture those that wasted their lives away. But there's one thing you don't understand." I thrust my hand back. "I understand you nearly killed me for nothing." "Yes, but that was before I saw you the way you really were. Listen to my words." Slowly I relaxed my posture, but I remained firm. "Why should I listen to you?" "I can help you out of your situation." "You owe me money, you snake," I said, my nostrils flaring. "You never needed the money in the first place." Taken aback, I retreated. "What do you mean?" I said. My arms relaxed once more. "You're a plumber, aren't you? I saw you come home from work. I also caught a look at your schedule. 40 hours a week for $38 an hour for 5 days a week. That's $36,000 a week for 2 weeks. You already have everything you need." "But you don't understand. They need 4,000, I pleaded. He wouldn't budge. "Trying to earn this money via dumb risks and chance will not get you anything. Look at all the things you've done wrong." "And I want to change that," I said, wiping my eyes as they began to tear. "But what am I supposed to do now?" "The only way you can earn that money is through grit and spit," he said, walking around me. "You aren't going to find solace through good luck alone, and you already have the tools that some people don't. If you give up now, you might as well have lost. Think about it." With those last words, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers, disappearing without a trace. Slowly, I gathered my things and walked out of the casino, head hanging low. The next day, I was fixing an old lady's faucet, inspecting the leak. I wondered what the demon's words had meant. Before I stuck the wrench up to the U-trap, I remembered my pay. If I worked the same amount of hours as before, I'd only make $3,600. But if I pulled off some overtime and worked several extra hours, I might just be able to pay off the debt. I started staying up much later than before. Not long after, my wife started becoming suspicious. Eventually, she confronted me. "Frank, you've been staying up late. You going back to the casinos again?" she asked, hands on her hips. I closed my eyes, and instead of fear, calmness filled my veins, and my blood stilled. "Not this time. I've been putting in some overtime." Her face loosened up for just a moment, before hardening again. I held my hands up and motioned my palms downward. "Listen, I've been horrible lately. All my gambling did was drown us deeper in debt." Her expression began to soften up again, her frown vanishing. "I want to change things. We used to work so well together, doing everything to help each other. Instead of fighting against each other, it's time we made our peace, and we bring us out of debt together." I held my hand out for her to shake. She kept her arm pulled back and folded like a pincer of a mantis. Inch by inch, though, she extended it and took my hand. The following day, my wife convinced me to go to therapy and get out of my addiction, which I gladly obliged. Simultaneously, she decided to start up another job working as an electrician. Day by day passed, and we pooled our resources as one. Before our eyes, bills were paid, and debt disappeared faster than our eye floaters. Our financial status wasn't the only thing that changed. Her once crusty mood lightened up, and she began to smile more. She began to believe my words and began to respect the changes I made. And then we paid off our rent. We got a letter from our landlord saying that we now were even. The moment that letter came in, we embraced each other. The only question now was, what were we going to do with the extra money? Not long ago, we ended up earning enough to create our own 3D project, this time of a companion cube. Day after day, we create more projects. Although we weren't as happy as our days back in college, we still could make the best of what we had. In retrospect, the hat-faced man put up a good fight, but I managed to come out of the casino with more than I'd gone in with. It wasn't exactly money, but it wasn't worthless either. Sounds like my tea's done. While I pour a cup and get comfy, let's move right on into our fourth story. It's always nice to go out for a bit, see nature, hike the trails. But it's even better when you're a kid. You never know what adventures you're going to find while you're out in the big world, or whether or not you might hear voices from the vent. I remember when playing behind my house was an endless exploration of imaginative adventures that could only further inspire my 8-year-old mind. Many times I was a barbarian warrior, like Conan, lopping off hands with my enchanted tree branch. The evil beasts conjured up in my mind stood no chance against my strength and wit, my lust for action and romantic adventure. However, I now realized just how close my world was to intertwining with the Sumerian, his fiction. For many years, the tales of sword and sorcery described monsters of unfathomable terror. Oh, such only brute force and unwavering mind of a fearless warrior could encounter and hope to defeat them. I was not this warrior, yet my discovery of a hidden terror seemed to be destined for me to find. For when I wandered off the set path which led from mine to my grandparents' house, I stumbled across a shaded patch of forest with a small, murky pond at its center. The area was dead quiet, save for the crunching of dead leaves beneath my feet and the occasional nerve-wracking pop of breaking twigs. I remember a slight fog over the water, more like a vapor dissipating, as if the pond was boiling. Yet, being an ignorant youth, I reached down and touched the surface and felt it was very cold, so much so that I drew my hand back in surprise, only to begin violently wiping my fingers on my clothes, for the liquid was like some sort of sticky alcohol. With the commotion I made, I heard across the water a soft rustling that seemed to be heading around the pond in my direction, but I stopped once I glanced towards it. For all my fear of the sound, my eyes suddenly came across a shape in the center of the pond. It was like a pale, smooth limestone, yet from it came a small, delicate trail of bubbles, escaping from an unseen pocket of air. Stupidly, I started to lean forward, squinting for a better look. I fell, my body submerging in the cold burning of the foggy liquid. I desperately tried to place my feet on whatever ground I could find, but there was none. I kicked and thrashed towards the surface, not wanting to open my eyes for fear of the liquid blinding me. Suddenly, I felt one of my feet strike something hard. The limestone, maybe? But in response, there came a sound, a low grunt of some kind. The pond began to build up a slight current, and, as if returning the favor, a sharp pain hit my thigh. I screamed into the mysterious water, and put all of my effort into reaching the shore of what now seemed to be an infinite ocean. I was no longer Conan as I breached the surface. I was a child crying out for his parents, smothering from the fumes of this potentially poisonous body of a creature-infested water. I climbed out after what seemed an eternity of an unwaking nightmare, and refused to look back as I ran from the pond. I expected to hear the sound of a monster breaching the pond's surface, but the silence of the dark woods remained unbroken. The vapors of the dry liquid trailed behind me as I desperately made for the familiar path. When it was in sight, I felt the calmness of familiarity, which caused me to slow my pace. The world was luminous with the summer evening, and the creatures of common knowledge went about their business, ignorant of what I had found. When I reached home, I wondered if I had only dreamed up another fantastic story in which I'd encountered the pond. There was no scent of the strange water, no more burning on my skin, but the fear in my heart returned as I looked down at my torn jeans and spied a coagulation of blood from a long scratch on my flesh. I hurried inside and tossed my clothes into the hamper, showering for good measure, unintentionally earning praise from my mother for being on top of my hygiene. I told my parents nothing about the pond or the scratch, but I couldn't completely hide my fearful glances to the window facing the edge of the forest during dinner. The question didn't come. All was normal within our house, which made me more and more at ease, as well as conscious of my illogical perception. The evening went on with my dad and I watching reruns of Star Trek, while my mom read one of her awful Amish-based novels in the lamplight. I look back on this time to comfort myself, given what was to follow. I was tucked into bed by my loving parents. Being an only child at the time, I was coddled quite a bit. The bedroom was alight with glow and dark stars, posters of Star Wars, shelves of action figures ready to defend me while I slumbered. The light of my aquarium and the shadow of the angelfish gliding on the wall eased me into a near doze, until the bubbles from the pump caused me to open my eyes in fear. Suddenly, as if responding to my fearful pondering, I heard a scratching in the vent near the right side of my bed. A soft clinking followed by breathing, as if something small was making a great effort to get through the grate. I was terrified. My hopes that my imagination from my playful excursions of the day had overtaken my senses were dashed. Yet the delusion refused to let loose its prisoner, which was my sanity. I knew I had to face it to prove its non-existence, so that logic could once again have dominion. "Hello?" I asked of the darkness. Immediately, the noise ceased, and in my mind's eye, I could see a rat scurrying away in fear of its discovery. But it was my contribution to this fable that was dismissed instead. "You found it, boy," came the whisper of a tiny creature behind the grate. My eyes welled with tears at the sound. I was about to call out to my parents when it continued. "All this time I tried to keep it hidden from the short nose, and a runt such as yourself seems compelled to find it and wake it up." The voice was irritated, yet it also contained fear in its reverence. "What was it?" I asked, in a trembling voice. My aquarium bubbled quietly, reminding me of the pale shape in the pond. "It is a manticore, one that has hibernated for many human lifetimes, but has ended far more. I was entrusted to watch over it by the one who placed it in the prison. You stirred it. Now it will soon awaken." As I rose up in bed, I forgot my fear of disturbing circumstances and speaking with hidden things. I knew what a manticore was. I knew it well enough to have it far from my mind to dream up during my woodland adventures, for the image of the creature caused real fear in me, though in a hypothetical sense. The image I had seen in books of monsters went through my brain and disturbed me anew. Now I realized that I had been scratched by the thing's relentless claws. Had I opened my eyes while submerged in the pond, I knew that I would have gone mad to see the shape within the burning fog. "What can I do?" I asked. It didn't respond, yet I could still hear it breathing in the vent. "Please, I didn't mean to wake it up," I whimpered. I was trembling beneath the bed sheets, which used to make me feel safe. Now I only felt cold and alone, guilty for bringing such a thing into this world. "You cannot put it back to sleep. It's been too long now, and it'll be hungry. You cannot hurt it with any weapon, for its flesh is invulnerable. It can eat you whole, and it'll leave no bones behind. Its roar is terrible, boy. Your mother, your father, will wake up to the sound of it, and will be taken by madness once it enters your home. It will devour your neighbors, all who dwell nearby, and no one will know what's happened to any of you." I fell out of my bed and onto the floor sobbing. I crawled to the vent and put my face down to it, without fear of what might happen. "What can I do?" I implored. "How can I kill it?" In the grate, I could see a tiny shape stirring within, 2 glimmers of silver light peering at me, and I could see the green flesh of a long, pointed nose. It was a goblin, small and mischievous looking, though at the moment the eyes looked sad and pitying. When it spoke for the final time, I sensed the want of a brighter circumstance. "If you wish to truly be the hero you pretend to be, you must slay it through its mouth." The eyes disappeared, and a soft, scrabbling shape faded into the darkness. I was alone with this frightening knowledge, and I had to make a choice. Should I return to my bed and risk waking up to the roar of the manticore, or did I face it that very night in the strange waters that it lay beneath? I was a child. I was scared, but I knew I couldn't let my family and my neighbors be devoured because of what I had done. I dressed, grabbed a flashlight and a small family picture propped up on the table next to my bed, then quietly went to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife from the rack. With my weapon in hand, I went out the back door to the swaying trees of a windy midnight. I started up the path with an empty mind, neither allowing terrible imagery nor doubting logic to hinder my strides. I wasn't brave, but I wasn't foolish. I simply was. The reality, or at least my perception of it, had been shattered into shapeless pieces of mirror that, no matter how well formed, could never show my reflection in its former naivete. I prayed that I wouldn't find the pond, but I knew for sure that I would. The shape would be there. I would have to go back into the water and somehow open the mouth of the manticore and shove my feeble knife into it. This was my plight. I was 8 years old, on an adventure in my favorite place to pretend, and I could feel a laughing mockery of my innocence when I left the path once more. There was no sound but the wind and the trees. A crescent moon in a star-filled sky watched me from afar. I held my family picture to my chest and watched the hills of dead leaves. The beam of my flashlight shone through the trees, who almost seemed lonely in this path. In true, this was a world left behind a long, long time ago, when fairies took flight, and in the gardens of elves, dryads danced for satyrs piping tunes. Whatever creatures flourished in this pocket of time so close to my home were long since devoured by the manticore. Likely whatever force imprisoned the beast also sent it here to our plane, as well as having the courtesy of leaving a goblin behind to watch over it, no doubt. I finally saw the pond reflecting its murky grayness with my flashlight, and my soul cried out within me as a cold fear enveloped my body. There were no more vapors floating on the surface. Neither was there a pale shape below. It was still and empty. The thoughts now began to race, both logical and fantastical. It was gone. It was never there. I can return to my warm bed and forget about it. It will be there waiting for me in the midst of my parents' innards. I wanted to scream for all the emotions, but it was the manticore that screamed into the night, sending a terrible jolt through my body. My bowels cramped at the sight of the giant face of a human hovering 10 feet in the air. The paws of an enormous lion's body thudded to the ground, the wings on its back flapping a gust that almost made me topple over. The barbed, porcupine-like tail flicked violently left to right, taking out a tree with one careless swipe. The eyes were large and bulging, yellow with black gashes for feline pupils. When my eyes met that of the monster's, it screamed again in satisfaction at its discovery of its first meal after so long its slumber. I could see its 3 rows of teeth as it howled at me, and yet somehow my only thought was, my parents are hearing this, and they're going to find out that I'm out of bed. They're going to look for me. They won't find me. I've been swallowed whole. When the manticore reached out to me, it stopped and gazed down at my tiny form and did something that finally snapped me out of my insane stupor. It grinned. The monster was grinning at my fear. The teeth were sharp and yellow. The stench of its breath broke through each of them, and made me almost vomit. Stagnation of time, the willingness of its stomach acid to return to its labor. The manticore was ready to indulge itself. It breathed in through its nostrils, then opened its mouth and slowly came down over my head. Yet, somehow, instead of succumbing to terror, a white-hot hatred took over. I was offended at how weak it perceived me. I was irritated at how much of a bully this thing was. This freak of nature had thrown its weight around eons ago and eradicated the peaceful world in which I lived. I refused to let this happen again. Not to my family, my neighbors, and certainly not to me. I stepped on the first layer of its teeth and stabbed the knife into its tongue. It screamed and began to try to close its jaws on me, but I had already climbed further in and now sank my knife into the roof of its mouth. The beast thrashed its head, trying to sling me out, but I kept climbing further in, slicing and stabbing all the way through. I remember the barbarous man of action that I pretended to be, and I embraced it fully, burrowing deep into its throat, spitting blood from my own mouth as I climbed. By the sudden change in its equilibrium, I could tell it had fallen to the ground and was struggling against the pain. I pressed my feet against the back of its throat and shoved my knife deep into its skull. I couldn't penetrate it, so I began to cut upward as hard as I could. Its screams were deafening, but I knew that it could hear my laughter as I sliced and mangled without mercy. Suddenly, I was drowned in cold, burning water from the pond, along with fresh screaming, as it mingled with the manticore's wounds. I lost my knife in the flood, but not my footing, or the family picture in my hand. I kissed it, then smashed the glass in the frame and shoved it into the open gash as hard as I could. The monster bellowed and suddenly began to whine pitifully. The thrashing ceased, and the water flowed inside until I was completely submerged. I began to swim out of the mouth, fearful of the teeth, but desperate to get out. My eyes burned horridly, and all the vision I had darkened from the night, so I felt my way past the teeth to the surface. Through the burning, I could make out the flashlight which lay on the ground, and I swam towards it, fearing the claws of the beast seizing me and pulling me under. Suddenly there were small hands grabbing my arms and helping me out of the pond. It was the goblin, though I could barely see its shape. "You did it, boy! You did it! You slew the manticore!" I was confused. All the effort I put forth to hurt the creature still hadn't been enough to kill it. The goblin continued to bellow his claim, and I expected any moment that the thing would come back up and chomp us both. Yet the creature was silent. I could see now that it had plunged head first into the pond and drowned itself. It's really dead?" I asked. "Poisoned. The water is deadly to manticores that ingest it, which is why it was put here to sleep. But they can hold their breath for a long time. You made it drink the water to relieve the torture, and now its innards will burn away." I fell back and watched the star-filled sky. A meteor passed, and with it went my wish to always have this bravery that overcame my impossible fear. As the years progressed in my life, I found myself abandoning my imagination, my thoughts of heroism, but I always remembered the moment when I accepted my new reality at the edge of the pond. Looks like our time might be almost up for today, but I think we've got one story left, still untold. It's always nice to have house guests, a little change from the norm, but when those house guests don't know when to go, well, it becomes a little bit irksome. So, join me as we find out what lives in the basement. I'm a little surprised that I'm writing this, since I was never that much into the supernatural. I say not that much because my older sister, Rita, was mesmerized by it. She was 6 years older than me. So most of what she did with her friends in the attic of our garage was a mystery. The garage attic was strictly off limits. They guarded it like an inner sanctum. It wasn't until my mother discovered the Ouija board that I began to understand that something was amiss. We weren't particularly religious, but we did attend church on holidays. My mother went on a tirade when my father got home from work, insisting that my sister was inviting evil spirits into our house. My dad threw out the Ouija board, and later, I picked it up out of the trash and used it for target practice with my brother's BB gun. None of that would have been particularly memorable, except the following night, my sister was babysitting me. Normally, as soon as my parents left, they would call Brenda down the street to come down and split the babysitting money with her and leave. I didn't complain, since Brenda was much more interested in my stories than my sister and her friends, but tonight, my sister stayed home and invited her friend Angie over. They told me to stay in my parents' room as they disappeared into the basement. I grew up in the Midwest, and we had one of those old, deep basements. The house was over 100 years old, and the basement was a place that I can only remember visiting maybe once or twice when I dropped some toys into the heating vent, and my dad had to go into the basement and disconnect some ductwork. There were only 2 small windows that were barely large enough for a child to fit through, but way too small for an adult. I remember there was a cold draft, too. There was a brick wall that butted up to the stairs, leading down to the basement, that had partially collapsed. I remember looking into that darkness and asking my dad where it led, and he said it led beneath the house. My parents never had to tell me not to go into the basement. I was petrified of it. I think I was playing with toy soldiers in my parents' room when I heard their blood-curdling screams. I don't remember being afraid, but they both came running up the basement stairs and ran straight past me out of the house, slamming the basement door behind them. I was 7 years old at the time. I had no idea why I didn't follow them. I just sat there on the floor with my toy soldiers. And then I heard the footsteps. I thought maybe it was one of my older brothers, Joey, who was down the street playing guitar with his friend Steven. They were always playing pranks. The door to the basement was locked. I could hear the door being pushed. The lock was just a wooden disc my dad had made. When they slammed the door, it had fallen down and locked. I heard it hit the floor when the door burst open. And that's about all I remember. I woke up the next day in the hospital. Later I was told that my sister had run down the street to get my brother, and they said they'd found me unconscious on the floor. The doctor said I'd had a convulsion. That's what I believed for 13 years, at least until last night. My sister Rita went on to become a flight attendant, and my brother Joey, I still call him that, became a DNR officer. We love each other dearly, but because I live on the other side of the country, we don't stay in touch as much as we used to. At least, we don't as often as when I was living in Michigan. I'd flown back from my father's funeral, and we were all reminiscing on my parents' porch. That's when my brother Joey brought up the night that I'd had the convulsion. He made us swear to never tell you the truth, Joey said, taking a long drag off his cigarette. But now that he's gone, I guess we can tell you what really happened. I looked over at Rita, thinking this might be a joke, but the look of dread on her face told me that whatever Joey was about to say was not for my amusement. "You sure this is a good idea?" she said nervously. Joey crushed his cigarette out on the wooden bench. "You didn't have a convulsion." Joey leaned in, the flicker of the porch light casting shadows across his face, making him look more solemn than usual. "What happened to you that night wasn't anything medical." There was a long, uncomfortable silence. For a moment, I thought he wasn't going to tell me what had happened. "When Rita and I got back to the house, we found something with you." Joey glanced at Rita, and as if on cue, she said, It wasn't human." My mind went to the rational explanation of a rabid dog or maybe a feral raccoon. They both laughed when I asked if it was an animal. "So what was it?" I said. "It was like a shadow, and it was floating above you," Rita said, her voice barely audible. I laughed and got up to go back inside. "I don't believe in ghosts," I said. "Wasn't no fucking ghost," Joey said, unbuttoning his shirt and showing me a scar on his chest. "You got that when you fell out of a tree," I replied. "I remember you telling me." "No, it's a story we made up. You did that to me," he said, tapping out another cigarette. Nothing in their demeanors suggested this was a prank, but perhaps I'd underestimated their acting skills. I was 7 years old. There's no way It went inside you, Joey said. He looked over at Rita, who finished his sentence. It possessed you. I know that sounds horrible, but it wasn't your fault. This had better be a hidden camera prank, I said, looking around. You picked me up in the air like I was a twig and threw me across the room. Then you started speaking in some crazy language, Joey said. It was my fault, Rita said, her eyes full of tears. Me and Angie asked the spirits to reveal themselves. None of this sparked any memories. How do you know you weren't imagining things? Joey laughed and looked down at his scar as he rebuttoned his shirt. I had trouble sleeping with you in my room for a year after that. You have any idea what it was like keeping that secret? A part of me wondered why they'd decided to break the news to me now. I looked over at Rita, hoping she would start laughing, but she was crying instead. Okay, so you two, what, saved me from an evil spirit? I asked sarcastically. Joey shook his head. Nah, Mom and Dad came home. My father was not a man prone to superstitions, so I was surprised when Joey decided to bring him into the story. And when he walked in, you started talking that crazy language, and then you started slinging Dad around the room like a wet noodle, he said, lighting a second cigarette. Joey laughed at the thought. I thought you were going to kill him, and that's when Mr. Payne walked in. I remembered Mr. Payne well. He always walked with a limp and was gardening in his backyard. We used to think it was funny that anyone had the last name Payne and that it would be perfect for a dentist, but he was a foreman at a factory. He heard the screams from across the street and came over to see what was wrong. Boy, did he ever get a surprise, Joey said. He was a good man, Rita said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. That thing started talking to him, and Mr. Payne started talking back in the same strange language. Joey was looking off in the distance. There's a lot you don't know about Mr. Payne. I couldn't help but think my siblings had watched The Exorcist one too many times. This is all unbelievable. I'm sorry. Did you know he studied to be a priest for 5 years and then gave it up when he met Mrs. Payne? Joey said, sitting on the porch rail. That's how he could speak to it. He studied those old languages. He started praying over you, and he asked Mom and Dad to get a priest, Rita added. I tried to envision Mr. Payne standing over me in prayer, but couldn't hold the thought. All sounded so fantastical. There was a whole room full of them praying over you, all night long, Joey said. Every once in a while, we'd hear a ruckus, and Mr. Payne and it would start talking to each other again. So sorry, Rita said, reaching out to grab my hand. I've been wanting to tell you, God, for so long. It was strange, hearing a story about myself that sounded like a fairy tale. I knew the only way to find out if it was true was to ask Mr. Payne myself, but I wasn't even sure he was still alive. Is Mr. Payne still alive? I asked. Yeah, Joey said. He's over at the old folks' home. I saw him there when I went to Dad's birthday party a couple of years ago. I told my brother and sister that it was hard to believe, but if it did happen, I had no memory of it and forgave them for whatever it was worth. Seemed like it was important for them to hear that I forgave them, but it didn't sound like they'd done anything wrong. What I didn't tell them was that I planned to visit Mr. Payne tomorrow before my flight for California. I had a few hours in the morning, and given the circumstances, it seemed like the most rational thing to do. In retrospect, it was obviously not the wisest choice. That night, I sat in my hotel room trying to figure out why my siblings had come up with such a ridiculous story. They were both teenagers, and maybe they had misunderstood the situation. I might have lost my mind temporarily and then had a convulsion. Except the people praying over me all night long didn't seem to fit the story. But it was a small town with plenty of superstitious people. Wouldn't be the first time a group of well-meaning religious folks misdiagnosed a medical condition for a supernatural event. I woke up early the next morning and headed over to the nursing home. The last time I'd been to Hazelbuck Nursing Home was during my childhood. I would visit with my mom when my cousin was living there. My cousin had multiple sclerosis, and I remembered the place smelling bad, like Clorox. My cousin was always in good spirits and smiling, but I could never get over the smell of the place. To my surprise, the place had been completely renovated, and it even smelled better. There was a young lady in the front who greeted me. I asked if Mr. Payne was still a resident, and she asked me to sign in and pointed me towards room 144. I stood outside the room for a few moments. I still had time to turn around and head back to my normal, boring life in California. The radio was on, and I could hear Ernie Harwell doing a play-by-play announcement for the Tigers baseball game. Against my better judgment, I knocked on the door and heard a gruff voice say, "Door's open. Come in." I walked in and saw Mr. Payne sitting in a recliner. He didn't look much different than I remembered him, but I could tell he was having trouble placing me. "It's Rich Thelen. You knew me as Richie," I said, smiling. Mr. Payne's demeanor changed immediately. It was as if he'd seen a ghost. I can come back another time if you..." No, it's fine. I just wasn't expecting to see anyone today." He pushed out a footrest. "Have a seat." I was suddenly uncomfortable. I guess I had half expected Mr. Payne to tell me it was just an overactive imagination, but judging from his reaction, I knew I wasn't going to like what he had to tell me. I thought about standing up and leaving. I'm sure he'd probably wonder why I showed up, but there was some doors that were just best to leave closed. This felt like one of those. "I heard about your dad. You just never know how long you got until the bell tolls." It took me a moment to reorient myself. I'd completely forgotten that I'd been at my dad's funeral yesterday. Yeah, he always said he'd probably die of a heart attack. My grandpa was 45 when he died the same way. "You mean Bill? I knew your grandpa. We used to hunt pheasant together." I didn't remember my grandpa. He died before I was born, so I didn't have anything to add. "I'm really surprised to see you," Mr. Payne said, slapping me on the knee. "You look good." "Thank you," I said, realizing I could just make small talk and leave. I didn't need to open any locked doors. I could just shoot the breeze. "So what brings you here?" Mr. Payne asked. "I came because I heard a crazy story, and I wanted to see if it was true." Mr. Payne ran his fingers through what was left of his gray hair. "I figured that's why you were here." Mr. Payne looked over his shoulder. "Can you get me some water? There's a cup next to the sink." I didn't know if that was a stall tactic or if he was preparing to give me a long speech, but I was happy to stand up and create some space between us. A few minutes later, I turned around with his water, and that's when I noticed he was holding a rosary. I handed him the water, and rather than sit back down, I took a couple of steps and leaned against the counter. "I've tried to forget that night," Mr. Payne said, sipping from the styrofoam cup. "You sure this wasn't just an overactive imagination?" I asked. The old man lifted an eyebrow. "Did they tell you what happened?" "What they could remember, yeah." Mr. Payne took a few more sips of water and thought for a long time. "Well, they were just kids, so they probably didn't tell you everything." I waited for him to say something, but he just sat there in silence. I don't think he really wanted to discuss it. "Mr. Payne, my brother said you dropped out of the priesthood." "I did. Mrs. Payne was a nun back then, and I was going to be a priest, but nature decided otherwise." I laughed, even though it wasn't funny. Again, I contemplated abruptly walking out of the room. "What you had in you was an old spirit, very old. It had come across the ocean from the old world, Europe. The language it spoke was Latin." None of this made any sense. Our house was old by the standards of the United States, but there was nothing ancient about it by European standards. "Why would an old spirit live in our basement?" I asked. Mr. Payne laughed. "Is that what they told you, that it was in your basement?" I nodded, surprised that there appeared to be a disagreement in their memories. Part of me hoped that the version I was about to hear was tethered in reality. It visited your basement because your sister and her friends called out to it, Mr. Payne said, his hand holding the rosary as it started to shake. I thought back to my brother telling me there was a lot of things I didn't know about Mr. Payne. That was suddenly starting to sound like an understatement. Then where did it come from? I asked. Mr. Payne's gaze went blank, and he started to mumble in a foreign language. That's when his eyes rolled back in his head, and a smile crossed his face. The following words rolled out of his mouth in a thick Italian accent. Venit ex me. A moment later, his whole body began to shake. I pushed the nurse button next to the bed, still grounded in reality. I thought he was having a stroke. He was talking much clearer now, and I tried to remember it. Sponsium cum Santa Fide. And then I saw it with my own eyes. Black smoke, like tentacles, lifted out of his body and started taking the shape of a human. I was no longer in the nursing home. I was a petrified 7-year-old boy on the floor holding a toy soldier. Everything I had repressed came back in a terrifying moment. The cries, the prayers, and eventually being freed. With the last of his strength, Mr. Payne whispered, Serveti ipsum, serveti ipsum. And a moment later, the shadows enveloped him and vanished. A caregiver eventually arrived a few minutes later. They said he was having one of his episodes and asked if I'd come back another day. I walked out of the nursing home and realized I'd reopened a door that Mr. Payne had locked with great difficulty and sacrificed 30 years ago. I didn't know the specifics of what Mr. Payne had done that night or what had happened in Rome that caused Mr. Payne to leave the priesthood, but something told me it was more than simply meeting his wife. A few months later, I looked up the meaning of those words. Mr. Payne was telling me he'd made a pact with the darkness, and then he told me to save myself. I pray every day to be spared the fate that Mr. Payne had. I also pray for his soul to be released. And perhaps, most importantly, I make sure I keep the basement door well locked. Sounds like the rain's stopping, and it sounds like our cozy tales may be at an end. I do hope you've enjoyed our time together today, and I hope you'll come back for more next time. Until then, this is Dr. Plague, wishing you a very happy day and a very spooky evening.